Hello and welcome to the Whispering Worlds channel. Sarah and Ethan's marriage crumbles when Sarah, feeling neglected, begins to doubt Ethan's loyalty without cause, ultimately leading her to betray him with his best friend, Greg. The devastating fallout ends in divorce, and both embark on separate paths of healing. Their journeys of self-discovery and personal growth are marked by moments of triumph and reflection, as they learn to rebuild their lives from the ground up. A chance reunion at Sarah's art exhibit allows them to find closure, reflecting on their shared past with understanding and respect. Though their paths remain separate, both emerge stronger, carrying the lessons of their love and loss into brighter, more fulfilling futures. The morning light filtered through the half-drawn blinds, casting long shadows across the bedroom. Sarah stood by the dresser, tugging the hem of her silk robe, her gaze fixed on her husband, Ethan, as he buttoned his crisp white shirt. He caught her eyes in the mirror and smiled, a warm, easy grin that usually melted her doubts. But not today. Are you sure you'll be back by 8? Sarah's voice was soft but laced with an edge of suspicion she couldn't quite mask. Ethan turned to face her, his brow furrowing. 8 at the latest. It's just a team dinner, nothing fancy. She nodded, not entirely convinced. It wasn't that Ethan had given her any reason to doubt him. If anything, he had always been the picture of devotion. Flowers on random Wednesdays, handwritten notes tucked into her lunch bag, stolen moments when he'd surprise her with a kiss while she cooked. Still, a nagging voice whispered in the back of her mind, planting seeds of doubt she couldn't silence. Okay, she said, forcing a smile. Have fun. Ethan crossed the room and kissed her forehead, lingering for a moment. I love you, Sarah. She nodded again but didn't say it back. The words felt heavy on her tongue. The day passed slowly. Sarah's thoughts kept drifting back to Ethan and the dinner he had mentioned. She imagined the table, surrounded by his colleagues. Were there women there? Was someone laughing a little too hard at his jokes? Touching his arm? She shook her head and scolded herself. Get a grip, she muttered under her breath as she folded laundry in the living room. But the seed of doubt had grown roots. She needed to talk to someone who would understand. By mid-afternoon, she found herself at her best friend Emily's house, a cozy bungalow with overstuffed furniture and the scent of lavender wafting through the air. Emily handed her a steaming mug of tea and sat down opposite her. All right, spill. What's going on? You've been fidgety since you walked in. Sarah hesitated, wrapping her hands around the warm ceramic mug. It's Ethan. Emily raised an eyebrow. What about Ethan? I don't know. It's nothing, probably. He's been distracted lately. And these dinners and late nights at work, they're happening more often. Emily leaned back, her expression unreadable. You think he's cheating? No. The word came out sharper than Sarah intended. She softened her tone. I mean, no, not really. It's just, I don't know. Something feels off. Emily sipped her tea thoughtfully. Men can be oblivious sometimes, you know? Maybe he's stressed about work. Or maybe you're reading too much into it. Sarah sighed. Maybe. But the conversation did little to ease her mind. That night, as she lay in bed waiting for Ethan to return, the doubts gnawed at her. Ethan arrived home at 8:30, apologizing for running late. Sarah had stayed up, pretending to read but watching the clock. He kissed her cheek, his breath carrying the faint scent of wine. How was it? She asked casually, setting the book down. Good. The team's excited about the new project. We might actually hit our goals this quarter. She nodded, studying his face. He seemed relaxed, his smile genuine. But the whispers of doubt wouldn't let her rest. Over the next few weeks, Sarah's suspicions grew. She found herself checking his phone when he wasn't looking, scrolling through his messages and emails. There was nothing incriminating, but her imagination filled in the blanks. She started questioning his every move. Why are you home so late? She asked one evening when Ethan walked in at 9 p.m. The client meeting ran long, he said, loosening his tie. I told you about it yesterday. Did you? Sarah's voice was icy. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. Yes, Sarah. I did. Her chest tightened. You don't have to get defensive. I'm just asking. I'm not defensive, he said, his tone calmer now. I just don't understand why you're acting like this. Do you not trust me? The question hung in the air like smoke. Sarah didn't answer, and Ethan walked away, his footsteps heavy on the stairs. In the weeks that followed, Sarah's unease turned into an obsession. She confided in Emily, who listened but offered little advice. It wasn't until one evening, during a casual dinner with Ethan's best friend, Greg, that Sarah felt the tension break. Greg was charming and attentive, quick with a joke and always ready to listen. He and Ethan had been friends since college, and he often stopped by for dinner or drinks. That night, as Ethan worked late again, Sarah found herself laughing at one of Greg's stories, her shoulders relaxing for the first time in days. You know, Greg said, his tone shifting, Ethan's lucky to have you. Sarah smiled, but there was a sadness behind it. Sometimes I wonder if he even notices me anymore. Greg's eyes softened. Trust me, he does. But the seed of doubt, now a twisted vine, had taken hold. And in Greg's gaze, Sarah saw something she hadn't expected. Understanding, even admiration. It was a fleeting moment, but it lingered in her mind long after Greg left that night. As Sarah lay in bed, Ethan sleeping soundly beside her, she stared at the ceiling. Her doubts had grown too large to ignore, and now they were pulling her in a direction she hadn't anticipated. The line between right and wrong blurred, and for the first time, Sarah wondered if her own actions might shatter the life she and Ethan had built together. The cracks in the mirror were growing, and Sarah was no longer sure they could be repaired. The days that followed were a blur of tension and unease. Sarah found herself walking a tightrope, her mind split between guilt and justification. She told herself she deserved to feel wanted, to feel seen, but the nagging voice in the back of her mind kept asking, at what cost? One evening, Sarah's phone buzzed with a message from Greg. It was casual, just a quick question about a restaurant he'd been meaning to try. But her heart skipped a beat as she replied. Their exchanges had grown more frequent, and though they remained harmless on the surface, Sarah knew there was an undercurrent of something more. At work, Ethan was oblivious to the storm brewing at home. His focus was consumed by the upcoming project launch. Late nights at the office were the norm, and though he missed Sarah, he assumed her recent moodiness was just a phase. She'll come around, he told himself. One evening, as he sat in the break room with his colleague, Jenna, he shared his concerns. Sarah's been distant lately, Ethan admitted, stirring his coffee. I feel like I'm losing her. Jenna, a sharp and no-nonsense woman in her 30s, tilted her head sympathetically. Maybe she's feeling neglected. You've been working nonstop, Ethan. Have you tried talking to her? I have, he said with a sigh. But it's like there's this wall between us. I don't know how to break through. Then maybe it's time to take a step back from work and focus on her, Jenna suggested. Before it's too late. Meanwhile, Sarah found herself confiding in Emily again. Greg messaged me, she admitted over lunch. It's nothing serious, but I don't know. I feel like he understands me in a way Ethan doesn't. Emily's expression darkened. Be careful, Sarah. Greg's Ethan's best friend. This could blow up in your face. I know, Sarah said, looking down at her plate. I just feel so alone. Ethan's always at work. He barely notices me anymore. That's not an excuse to cross lines, Emily said firmly. Talk to Ethan. Tell him how you feel. But don't go looking for answers in the wrong places. That night, as Sarah scrolled through her phone in bed, a message from Greg appeared. Greg, had a great time chatting earlier. Let me know if you ever need to vent. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She wanted to reply, to keep the conversation going, but Emily's words echoed in her mind. With a deep breath, she locked her phone and turned to Ethan, who was lying beside her, already asleep. The sight of him, so peaceful and unaware, tugged at her heart. She reached out and placed a hand on his arm, but he didn't stir. Tears welled in her eyes as she realized just how far apart they had drifted. The following weekend, Ethan surprised Sarah with a spontaneous date night. He booked a reservation at her favorite Italian restaurant and even picked out a dress for her to wear. Sarah's heart fluttered as she saw him standing in the doorway, holding out the dress with a sheepish grin. "I thought we could use some time together," he said. Sarah smiled, a genuine warmth spreading through her chest. "I'd love that." The evening started beautifully. Over candlelight and wine, they laughed and reminisced about their early days together. For a moment, Sarah felt the doubts and shadows melt away. She saw the man she had fallen in love with, the one who made her feel safe and cherished. But the moment shattered when Ethan's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it, his expression tightening. "It's just work," he said, silencing the phone. "You can take it if it's important," Sarah offered, though her tone betrayed her frustration. "It's fine," Ethan insisted, but the spell was broken. The rest of the dinner felt forced, their earlier connection fading into polite conversation. Later that night, Sarah lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The evening had been a reminder of what they once had, but it also highlighted how far they drifted. She thought about Greg and the ease with which he made her laugh, the way he seemed to see her in a way Ethan no longer did. The whispers of doubt grew louder, and Sarah felt herself slipping further into the shadows. She told herself it was harmless, just a friendship, but deep down, she knew she was playing with fire. Greg's text lingered in Sarah's mind for days. The memory of their last conversation, his easy laughter, and the warmth in his eyes clung to her, a comforting distraction from the growing void in her marriage. She found herself waiting for his messages, her phone becoming a lifeline to a part of her she thought had been lost. One afternoon, Sarah's resolve wavered. Ethan had left early for work again, his only goodbye a distracted peck on her cheek. The silence of the house felt oppressive, and before she could stop herself, she texted Greg. "Sarah, do you have time for coffee today?" His reply came almost instantly. "Greg, for you? Always." They met at a small cafe on the edge of town, a place neither had frequented before. Sarah chose it deliberately, a neutral ground where the familiarity of their shared lives couldn't intrude. Greg greeted her with a warm smile, pulling her into a quick hug. "You look great," he said, his eyes lingering on hers for a moment too long. Sarah felt a blush creep up her neck. "Thanks. You too." As they settled into a corner booth, the conversation flowed effortlessly. They talked about everything and nothing, avoiding the obvious undercurrent of tension that buzzed between them. Sarah felt seen, understood in a way she hadn't in months. "You're not happy, are you?" Greg's question came softly, his gaze steady. Sarah hesitated, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "I don't know. Things with Ethan, they're complicated." "He doesn't appreciate you," Greg said, his tone firm. "If he did, he wouldn't leave you feeling this way." The words struck a chord, resonating with the doubts that had taken root in her mind. She looked away, unable to meet his eyes. "It's not that simple." Greg reached across the table, his hand brushing hers. "It could be." That night, Sarah returned home with a mix of emotions swirling in her chest. Guilt, longing, and a faint thrill that scared her more than she wanted to admit. Ethan was already in bed, his laptop balanced on his knees as he typed furiously. "Late night?" she asked, leaning against the doorway. "Big presentation tomorrow," he said without looking up. "Sorry, I'll be done soon." Sarah nodded, her earlier guilt sharpening into anger. "Of course. Always work." Ethan paused, finally glancing up at her. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing," she said quickly, turning away. "Good night." Over the next few weeks, Sarah's meetings with Greg became more frequent. What started as innocent coffee dates evolved into long drives and stolen moments. Each interaction blurred the lines further, and though neither acknowledged it openly, the weight of unspoken feelings hung heavily between them. One evening, as they sat parked by the lake, Greg broke the silence. "Sarah, I can't keep doing this." Her heart sank. "What do you mean?" He turned to face her, his expression pained. "Pretending this is just friendship. Care about you more than I should, and I think you feel the same." Sarah's breath caught. She wanted to deny it, to cling to the safety of the life she knew, but the truth was undeniable. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered, "I don't know what to do." Greg reached for her hand, his grip firm but gentle. "You don't have to decide now. Just think about what makes you happy. You deserve that." At home, Ethan's obliviousness continued to fuel Sarah's resentment. He was engrossed in his work, his attention to her growing increasingly sporadic. She knew she should talk to him, confront the widening gap between them, but the thought of facing the reality of their marriage felt insurmountable. Instead, she threw herself deeper into her connection with Greg. Their moments together became an escape, a world where she felt valued and alive. Yet, the guilt lingered, a constant shadow that tainted even the sweetest of their stolen moments. Ethan, meanwhile, began to sense the shift. Sarah's distance was no longer subtle. Her smiles rarely reached her eyes, and her once gentle touch had grown cold. He tried to bridge the gap, planning another date night, but his efforts only seemed to push her further away. One evening, after another failed attempt at connection, Ethan confided in Jenna. "I don't know what to do," he admitted, his voice heavy with frustration. "She's slipping away, and I don't know how to stop it." Jenna studied him carefully. "Have you asked her what she needs?" "Sometimes it's not about fixing things, Ethan. It's about listening." Ethan nodded, her words striking a chord. "You're right. I need to try harder." But by the time Ethan resolved to fight for his marriage, the lines had already blurred too far. Sarah stood at a crossroads, her heart pulled in two opposing directions. She knew a choice had to be made, but no matter which path she took, someone would get hurt, including herself. The tension between Sarah and Ethan had reached a boiling point, though neither acknowledged it directly. Their days were filled with surface-level conversations, their interactions reduced to polite exchanges that lacked any real warmth. Sarah found herself dreading evenings at home, while Ethan tried desperately to ignore the growing distance between them. But the truth, as it often does, had a way of forcing itself into the light. One Friday evening, Sarah sat in the living room scrolling through her phone when Ethan walked in, his expression uncharacteristically grim. He held a familiar envelope in his hand, a letter from their mutual friend, Melissa, who had recently moved out of state. "Sarah," he began, his voice steady but strained, "we need to talk." She looked up, startled by his tone. "What's wrong?" Ethan set the envelope on the coffee table and sat down across from her. "Melissa wrote me. She mentioned some things about you and Greg." Sarah's heart plummeted. Her mouth went dry as she struggled to find words. What did she say?" "She said she'd seen the two of you together, multiple times," Ethan replied, his eyes searching hers. "She thought I should know." The room fell into a heavy silence. Sarah's mind raced, her carefully constructed world beginning to crumble. "Ethan, it's not what you think?" she stammered, though even she wasn't sure what she meant. "Then tell me," he said, his voice rising slightly, "because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been hiding something." The confrontation spiraled quickly. Sarah's initial attempts to deny and deflect only seemed to fuel Ethan's anger. Finally, unable to hold back the flood of emotions, she confessed. "I've been spending time with Greg," she admitted, tears streaming down her face. "But it wasn't supposed to mean anything. I was lonely, Ethan. I felt invisible for so long." Ethan's face twisted with a mixture of pain and disbelief. "So instead of talking to me, you turned to my best friend? Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I didn't mean for it to go this far," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. I needed someone." Ethan stood abruptly, pacing the room as he tried to process her words. "Do you love him?" he asked, the question cutting through the air like a blade. "No," Sarah said quickly. "I don't know. It's not that simple." "It's a yes or no question, Sarah," Ethan snapped. "Do you love him?" "I love you," she said, desperation in her voice. "But I don't know how to fix this." The days that followed were a blur of strained silences and heated arguments. Ethan moved into the guest room, unable to share a bed with Sarah as he grappled with her betrayal. He avoided Greg entirely, the pain of his best friend's involvement too fresh to confront. Meanwhile, Sarah found herself adrift, consumed by guilt and regret. She reached out to Emily, who listened patiently but offered little comfort. "You made a mistake," Emily said bluntly. "Now you have to decide what you want. Ethan deserves to know if you're still committed to him." "I don't know what I want," Sarah admitted. "I feel like I've ruined everything." Greg, too, was feeling the weight of the situation. He texted Sarah less frequently, sensing the damage their actions had caused. One evening, he called her, his voice heavy with remorse. "I'm sorry for everything," Greg said. "I never wanted to hurt Ethan, and I hate that I've put you in this position." "It's not your fault," Sarah replied, though she knew it wasn't entirely true. "We both made choices. I think it's best if we stop seeing each other," Greg said after a long pause. "For everyone's sake." Sarah's chest tightened, but she nodded. "You're right." The breaking point came on a Sunday afternoon. Ethan called Sarah into the living room, where he sat with his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice raw. "I've been trying to figure out a way to move past this, but I can't. Every time I look at you, all I see is the betrayal." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Ethan, please. I'll do anything to make this right." "It's too late," he said, shaking his head. "I think we need to separate." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She felt her world collapse around her, the weight of her actions finally crashing down. But as much as she wanted to fight for their marriage, she knew Ethan was right. They had reached a point of no return. Ethan began making plans to move out, their once shared life now divided into boxes and belongings. The house, once filled with laughter and love, felt empty and cold. Sarah watched him pack, her heart breaking with every item he placed into a suitcase. As Ethan prepared to leave, he paused at the door, turning to face her one last time. "I loved you, Sarah," he said, his voice trembling. "I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for." And with that, he was gone, leaving Sarah alone in the silence of a home that no longer felt like hers. The weeks after Ethan's departure were a blur for Sarah. The once vibrant home she had shared with him now felt cavernous and empty, every corner echoing with memories she couldn't escape. Her days were filled with the mechanical tasks of living, work, groceries, bills, but the nights were the hardest. The silence was deafening. Emily visited often, bringing takeout and offering quiet companionship. "You need to stop punishing yourself," she said one evening as they sat on the couch, plates of half-eaten pizza on the coffee table. Sarah shook her head. "I can't stop thinking about everything I've done. I broke his heart, Emily. I destroyed our life. And now you have to figure out what's next," Emily replied gently. "You can't change the past, but you can decide where you go from here." Ethan, meanwhile, had relocated to a small apartment in a city 3 hours away. He threw himself into his work, finding solace in the structure and predictability it offered. But the quiet moments between meetings and late at night often found him staring out his window, wrestling with the ache of loss and the anger that lingered just beneath the surface. One evening, his new colleague, Mark, invited him out for drinks. "You look like you could use a break," Mark said, clapping him on the shoulder. Reluctantly, Ethan agreed, hoping the distraction might dull the edges of his pain. The bar was lively, filled with the hum of conversation and the clink of glasses. Ethan sipped his drink slowly, listening as Mark talked about his recent hiking trip. As the evening wore on, he found himself laughing at Mark's stories, the tension in his chest easing slightly. "You're gonna be all right," Mark said, raising his glass in a toast. "Life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it." Ethan nodded, the words settling somewhere deep within him. Maybe Mark was right. Maybe there was a path forward, even if he couldn't see it yet. Back in her empty house, Sarah began the painful process of self-reflection. She started seeing a therapist, a kind woman named Dr. Klein, who gently guided her through the tangled web of her emotions. "Why do you think you turned to Greg?" Dr. Klein asked during one session. Sarah hesitated, searching for the right words. I felt invisible," Ethan was so focused on work, and I needed to feel like I mattered to someone. And do you feel like you matter now? Dr. Klein pressed. Sarah's eyes welled with tears. I don't know. I'm trying to figure that out. That's a good place to start, Dr. Klein said with a small smile. Healing takes time, Sarah. Be patient with yourself. Months passed, and slowly, both Sarah and Ethan began to rebuild their lives. Sarah started volunteering at a local shelter, finding purpose in helping others. She discovered a passion for painting, spending hours in her makeshift studio, pouring her emotions onto the canvas. Ethan, on the other hand, took up hiking, inspired by Mark's stories. The solitude of the trails and the challenge of reaching new heights gave him a sense of clarity and peace he hadn't felt in years. One day, while exploring a trail near his apartment, Ethan met a woman named Claire. She was cheerful and easygoing, her laughter infectious. They struck up a conversation, and by the end of the hike, Ethan found himself smiling more than he had in months. Maybe Mark was right, he thought as they exchanged numbers. Life does have a way of surprising you. Sarah's journey was less straightforward. She still thought about Ethan often, the weight of her choices a constant presence. But she also began to see glimpses of a new version of herself. One that was stronger, more self-aware, and determined to find happiness on her own terms. One evening, while attending an art exhibit downtown, she ran into Greg. It was awkward at first, the air thick with unspoken apologies and lingering regrets. I've been meaning to reach out, Greg said, shifting uncomfortably. I wanted to say I'm sorry for everything. Sarah nodded, her voice steady. Me too. They talked for a while, both acknowledging the hurt they had caused and the lessons they had learned. By the end of the conversation, Sarah felt a sense of closure she hadn't realized she needed. As the year drew to a close, Sarah and Ethan were living separate lives, but both had found a measure of peace. They hadn't spoken since the divorce, but there was an unspoken understanding that their story had reached its end. One crisp winter morning, as Sarah stood on her porch sipping coffee, she felt a sense of quiet hope. The pain of the past would always be a part of her, but it no longer defined her. She was ready to step into whatever came next. And somewhere in another city, Ethan laced up his hiking boots, ready to tackle a new trail. For the first time in a long time, he felt the weight on his chest begin to lift. Life, he realized, was about finding strength in the broken places and learning to move forward, one step at a time. Spring arrived with a subtle promise of renewal. The snow that had blanketed the city melted into rivulets along the sidewalks, and the trees began to bud with fresh green leaves. For Sarah, the change in season mirrored her own gradual transformation. Life wasn't easy, but it felt less heavy, less suffocating. One sunny afternoon, Sarah stood in front of her latest painting, a swirling blend of warm and cool tones that seemed to pulse with emotion. She tilted her head, studying the piece. Beautiful, a soft voice said from behind her. Sarah turned to see Dr. Klein, who had agreed to meet her for coffee after a particularly introspective session. Sarah smiled. Thanks. It's how I've been feeling lately. Chaotic, but somehow alive. Dr. Klein nodded. Art is a powerful way to process emotions. You're doing more than painting. You're healing. Sarah's heart swelled with gratitude. I'm trying, she said quietly. Ethan's life, too, had settled into a new rhythm. He spent weekends exploring trails and evenings reading books that had long gathered dust on his shelves. Claire's companionship had grown from casual hikes to heartfelt conversations over dinners. Her presence was warm and uncomplicated, a sharp contrast to the tangled emotions of his past. One evening, as they sat by a campfire on a hiking trip, Claire turned to him, her expression thoughtful. Do you ever think about her? She asked, her voice gentle. Ethan's gaze dropped to the flames. Sometimes, he admitted. Not in the same way, though. It's more like wondering if she's okay. Claire reached for his hand. You're a good man, Ethan. He smiled faintly, squeezing her hand. I'm trying to be. Months passed, and fate, or coincidence, brought Sarah and Ethan back to the same city for the first time since their separation. Sarah was invited to showcase her art at a gallery downtown, while Ethan attended a leadership conference at a nearby hotel. Neither knew the other would be there, their paths crossing once more under unexpected circumstances. Sarah's nerves were on edge as she walked into the gallery. The room buzzed with conversation and the clinking of glasses, but her focus remained on her paintings. She felt vulnerable, as though her heart was on display alongside her art. She was mid-conversation with a potential buyer when she noticed him. Ethan stood near one of her larger pieces, his posture relaxed but his eyes intent as he studied the canvas. Sarah's breath hitched, and she excused herself, weaving through the crowd toward him. "Ethan," she said softly. He turned, surprise flickering across his face before it softened into a smile. "Sarah," he said, "this is your work?" She nodded, feeling a mix of pride and trepidation. "It is. What do you think?" He looked back at the painting, a piece dominated by bold strokes of red and black, with streaks of gold cutting through the chaos. "It's powerful," he said. "Raw." Sarah's lips curled into a faint smile. "That's how I felt when I painted it." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "You found something that makes you happy," he said. "I'm glad." "So have you," Sarah replied, noticing the relaxed confidence he now carried. "Claire seems wonderful." Ethan's eyebrows raised. "You know about Claire?" "Emily mentioned her," Sarah admitted. "She's happy for you, Ethan." "So am I." For the first time in a long while, they shared a genuine smile. It wasn't laced with bitterness or regret, but with the quiet understanding of two people who had weathered a storm and emerged stronger. Later that night, as Sarah stood by the gallery's window watching the city lights, she felt a presence beside her. It was Ethan. "I don't think I ever said this," he began, his voice low. "But I'm sorry for the ways I failed you." Sarah turned to him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "And I'm sorry for the choices I made that hurt you." He nodded, his gaze steady. "We weren't perfect, but I'm grateful for what we had. It shaped me." Sarah's voice trembled as she replied, "Me too." As the evening wound down, they parted ways with a quiet hug, both knowing it was likely the last time they would see each other. But there was no sadness in their goodbye, only a sense of closure and the promise of brighter days ahead. At the end of the night, Sarah walked home with her heart lighter than it had been in years. She glanced up at the stars, her lips curving into a small, hopeful smile. Life had brought her to a crossroads, but for the first time, she felt ready to take the next step, wherever it might lead. The meeting at the gallery lingered in Sarah's mind in the days that followed. It wasn't just the unexpected reunion with Ethan but the sense of finality it brought. She had closed a chapter of her life, one that had been filled with love, pain, and lessons she would carry forward. But life, as she was beginning to understand, was about turning pages, not clinging to the words already written. Sarah's art began gaining recognition after the gallery show. Her bold, emotional pieces resonated with people, and she was invited to participate in more exhibits. Though the attention was new and sometimes overwhelming, she welcomed it as a sign that she was moving in the right direction. One day, while painting in her home studio, she received a call from a local magazine interested in featuring her work. "We'd love to do a profile on you," the editor said. "Your story and art have touched so many people." Sarah hesitated. Sharing her story meant revisiting painful memories, but it also meant embracing how far she'd come. "I'd be honored," she finally replied. Ethan, meanwhile, continued to build his life in the new city. His relationship with Claire deepened, their shared adventures bringing a sense of joy and stability he hadn't realized he craved. One evening, as they cooked dinner together in his apartment, Claire brought up a topic that had been on her mind. "Have you thought about reaching out to Sarah again?" she asked gently. Ethan paused, setting down the knife he was using to chop vegetables. "We said everything we needed to at the gallery." "Maybe," Claire said, "but sometimes it's good to check in, not for closure, but to acknowledge the part someone played in your life." He considered her words. It wasn't that he harbored resentment towards Sarah anymore. In fact, he often thought about her with a sense of gratitude. Their relationship, though tumultuous, had taught him resilience and clarity about what he wanted in life. Months later, Sarah's magazine feature was published. The article, titled Rebuilding with Color, The Journey of Sarah Bennett, told the story of a woman who had transformed heartbreak into art and found herself in the process. It was raw and honest, and it resonated deeply with readers. Ethan came across the article by chance. Flipping through a copy of the magazine at a coffee shop, he froze when he saw her name. He read every word, a mixture of emotions stirring within him: pride, sadness, and a faint sense of longing for the days when they had been each other's anchors. He decided to send her an email. Subject: Your article. Hi Sarah. I just read the piece about you in local Canvas. I wanted to say how proud I am of everything you've accomplished. Your art is incredible, and it's clear you've found something that brings you peace and fulfillment. I've thought about our conversation at the gallery a lot. I'm glad we had the chance to talk and find some closure. I hope you're doing well. Take care, Ethan. Sarah read Ethan's email late at night, sitting in her studio with a cup of tea. Tears pricked her eyes, not from sadness but from the warmth of his words. She replied the next morning. Subject: Your article. Hi Ethan. Thank you for your kind words. It means so much to me that you reached out. I'm glad you read the article. It wasn't easy to share, but I felt it was important. I thought about our conversation too. I'm grateful for it and for everything we've learned from each other. I hope you're finding happiness and peace in your new life. Take care, Sarah. The exchange left them both with a sense of quiet contentment. They were no longer part of each other's daily lives, but they had found a way to honor what they had shared without lingering in the past. As the seasons changed again, Sarah prepared for her biggest exhibit yet, a solo show titled Turning Pages. Each piece in the collection represented a pivotal moment in her journey, from heartbreak to healing, from loss to rediscovery. On opening night, as she stood in the gallery greeting visitors, she felt a sense of pride and peace she hadn't known before. She had turned the page, and the story ahead was hers to write. Somewhere in another city, Ethan and Claire toasted to new beginnings over dinner, their laughter filling the room. Their lives had taken different paths, but both were filled with hope, love, and the promise of what lay ahead. The past was a part of them, but it no longer defined them. They were ready to keep turning pages. The sun filtered through the windows of Sarah's new studio, casting warm light on the walls adorned with her paintings. It had been a year since the gallery show, Turning Pages, and her life had settled into a rhythm that felt both fulfilling and peaceful. She still thought about Ethan occasionally, not with longing but with appreciation for the role he had played in her story. This morning was different. An email from a university in the city had arrived in her inbox. They were offering her a position as an adjunct professor to teach a course on art and emotional expression. It was an opportunity she had never imagined, but one that felt perfectly aligned with her journey. That evening, Sarah met Emily for dinner at their favorite restaurant. The two friends had grown even closer over the past year, their bond strengthened by shared experiences and unwavering support. You have to take it, Emily said, her eyes lighting up. You've been given the chance to inspire a whole new generation of artists. It's just a little intimidating, Sarah admitted, swirling her wine glass. I'm used to creating in solitude. Teaching is a whole different world. You're more than ready, Emily said firmly. If anyone can guide people through the power of art, it's you. Sarah smiled, her friend's confidence bolstering her own. Maybe you're right. Meanwhile, in his apartment, Ethan flipped through an old photo album he had recently unearthed while packing. The pictures chronicled his years with Sarah, from their first date to their wedding day and the countless moments in between. He paused at a photo of the two of them at the beach, their faces flushed with laughter. Claire entered the room, noticing the album in his hands. She sat beside him, her expression gentle. Taking a trip down memory lane? Ethan nodded. It's strange. Looking at these doesn't hurt anymore. It just reminds me of how much we've both grown. Claire rested her head on his shoulder. That's a good thing. isn't it? Yeah, Ethan said with a faint smile. It really is. A few weeks later, Sarah stood in front of her first class. The room buzzed with quiet anticipation as students settled into their seats. She took a deep breath, holding onto the words she had rehearsed the night before. Welcome to Art and Emotional Expression, she began, her voice steady. Over the next few months, we'll explore how art can help us process our emotions, tell our stories, and connect with others. As she spoke, Sarah felt a sense of purpose she hadn't expected. She was no longer defined by the pain of her past but by the strength she had gained and the knowledge she could share. Ethan, too, was finding new ways to give back. Inspired by his hikes and the peace they brought him, he volunteered to lead outdoor therapy sessions for individuals struggling with anxiety and stress. His first group was small but eager, and as they walked through the trails, he shared his own journey of healing. Nature has a way of grounding us, he told the group, pausing to admire the sunlight filtering through the trees. It reminds us that even in the toughest seasons, growth is possible. One weekend, Sarah's work brought her to Ethan's city for an art conference. The thought of reaching out to him crossed her mind, but she decided against it. They had said their goodbyes, and she didn't want to disrupt the lives they had built apart. Still, as she walked through the bustling streets, she felt a quiet hope that he was doing well. Ethan, unaware of Sarah's presence in the city, spent that same weekend leading a hike. As he stood atop a hill overlooking the valley, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. His life was far from perfect, but it was his own, and that was enough. Their paths might never cross again, but both Sarah and Ethan carried the lessons of their shared past with them. They were no longer bound by the mistakes and pain that had once defined them. Instead, they had grown into people who could look back with gratitude and forward with hope. As Sarah packed her bags to return home, she glanced out the window at the skyline. The world was vast, filled with possibilities she hadn't yet explored, and for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to embrace them. Ethan, driving home after the hike, turned up the radio as his favorite song came on. The road stretched ahead, open and full of promise. Both of them, in their own way, were moving forward, not forgetting the past, but carrying its lessons into the future. They were free at last to reflect, to grow, and to live. Autumn arrived in a blaze of amber and gold, the crisp air carrying the scent of fallen leaves and promise of change. Sarah's life had settled into a comfortable rhythm, her days filled with teaching, painting, and moments of quiet reflection. Her students often left her inspired, their eagerness to explore art reminding her of her own journey toward healing and self-expression. One Friday afternoon, after dismissing her last class, Sarah lingered in the studio, cleaning brushes and organizing supplies. A soft knock at the door startled her. She turned to see a young woman with a shy smile. "Hi, Ms. Bennett," the student began. "I just wanted to thank you for today's class. I've been struggling with some things, and painting really helps." Sarah's heart swelled with empathy. "I'm glad it's been helpful. Art has a way of giving voice to things we can't always say out loud." The student nodded, her eyes bright with gratitude. "You've been a big part of that for me." As the student left, Sarah felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had found her place, not just as an artist, but as someone who could help others find their way. Meanwhile, Ethan was preparing for a weekend retreat in the mountains. The group he led had grown steadily, their sessions blending physical challenge with emotional growth. He found meaning in helping others connect with nature and themselves, the experience mirroring his own journey of self-discovery. As he loaded supplies into his car, Claire joined him, holding a thermos of coffee. "You ready for the weekend?" she asked, handing him the cup. Ethan smiled. "Always. This group has been making a lot of progress. It's rewarding to see them open up." Claire kissed his cheek. "You're good at this, you know." "Thanks," he said, his gaze drifting to the horizon. "I've come a long way from where I was." On Saturday morning, Sarah attended a small gathering hosted by a local nonprofit that supported emerging artists. She had been asked to give a short talk about her journey and how art had helped her heal. Standing in front of the intimate crowd, Sarah felt a mix of nerves and gratitude. For me, art became a way to process emotions I didn't have words for, she began. It allowed me to confront my pain, but it also showed me that beauty and meaning can come from the hardest moments of our lives. Her words resonated with the audience, and afterward, several people approached her, sharing their own stories of struggle and renewal. Sarah listened intently, each story reinforcing her belief in the transformative power of creativity. Ethan's retreat group spent the weekend hiking, meditating, and sharing their experiences around the campfire. On the final evening, as the group sat beneath a sky scattered with stars, Ethan posed a question. "What's one thing you've learned about yourself this weekend?" One by one, the participants spoke, their answers ranging from discovering inner strength to letting go of fear. When it was Ethan's turn, he hesitated, then said, "I've learned that healing isn't about erasing the past. It's about learning to carry it differently." The group nodded in understanding, the firelight casting their faces in warm, flickering shadows. That same evening, Sarah sat in her studio, working on a new painting. The piece was unlike anything she had created before, a blend of soft pastels and bold strokes that seemed to dance across the canvas. It felt hopeful, almost celebratory. Her phone buzzed with a message from Emily. "Thinking about you tonight. So proud of how far you've come." Sarah smiled, typing back a quick reply. "Thank you. I wouldn't have made it without you." By Sunday evening, Ethan returned home from the retreat, his body tired but his spirit renewed. As he unpacked, Claire handed him a small envelope. "What's this?" he asked, curious. "Something that came for you while you were away," she replied with a wink. Ethan opened the envelope to find a thank you card from one of his retreat participants. Inside was a heartfelt message about how the weekend had changed their perspective and given them hope. Ethan felt a warmth spread through his chest as he read the words. That night, as Sarah cleaned her brushes and Ethan prepared for bed, both found themselves reflecting on the journeys that had brought them to this point. Their lives were no longer entwined, but they had each discovered something profound, the gift of presence. For Sarah, it was being fully immersed in her art and the connections it fostered. For Ethan, it was in the simplicity of guiding others through the wilderness and witnessing their growth. Though their paths had diverged, they carried the lessons of their shared past, grateful for the experiences that had shaped them. And as the stars dotted the night sky, both Sarah and Ethan closed their eyes, feeling at peace with where they were and eager for what lay ahead. Winter settled over the city, bringing with it a quiet stillness. Snow blanketed the streets and rooftops, softening the sharp edges of the world. For Sarah and Ethan, it marked another year since their lives had diverged, a year filled with growth, healing, and the discovery of new purpose. Sarah stood at the window of her studio, watching the snowflakes drift lazily to the ground. Her latest painting, a swirling blend of icy blues and warm golds, sat drying on the easel behind her. It was her final piece for an upcoming exhibit, one she had titled Full Circle. The exhibit had drawn significant attention, with critics praising her ability to capture raw emotion and transformation through her art. Sarah had poured her heart into this collection, each piece a reflection of her journey from heartbreak to renewal. As she prepared to leave for the gallery that evening, she glanced at her phone. A message from Emily popped up. "Tonight's the big night. I'll be there cheering you on." Sarah smiled, her heart warmed by her friend's unwavering support. Ethan, meanwhile, had spent the day leading one final retreat for the year. The group had braved the snow-covered trails, their laughter and camaraderie a stark contrast to the cold, quiet landscape. As they returned to the lodge, Ethan reflected on how much his life had changed. That evening, as he sat by the fire with Claire, he scrolled through his phone and came across a mention of Sarah's exhibit in a local art publication. The headline read, "Sarah Bennett's Full Circle, a Journey of Healing Through Art." Claire noticed his expression. "Thinking about her." Ethan nodded. "It's good to see her thriving. She's worked hard to get there." Claire smiled, resting a hand on his. "It's a testament to how far you've both come." The gallery buzzed with energy as guests admired Sarah's work. She moved through the crowd, exchanging smiles and handshakes, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. Each piece on display felt like a chapter of her life, a testament to the strength she had found within herself. At the center of the room hung her favorite painting, Full Circle. It depicted a single tree standing tall amidst a storm, its roots reaching deep into the earth while its branches stretched toward a golden sky. It was a symbol of resilience, growth, and the beauty that could emerge from even the darkest moments. "It's breathtaking," Emily said, joining Sarah by the painting. "It's like you've captured everything you've been through and turned it into something beautiful." Sarah's eyes glistened as she nodded. "That's exactly what I wanted to do." Unbeknownst to Sarah, Ethan had decided to attend the exhibit. He lingered near the entrance, taking in the paintings from a distance. Each piece spoke to him, not just as an observer but as someone who had shared in the journey they represented. When he reached Full Circle, he stopped. The painting seemed to radiate a quiet strength, its golden hues catching the light in a way that felt almost alive. Ethan's chest tightened with a mixture of pride and bittersweet emotion. "Ethan?" Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts. He turned to see her standing nearby, her expression a mix of surprise and warmth. "Hey," he said softly. "I hope it's okay that I'm here." Sarah smiled, her heart steady. "Of course it is." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. Finally, Ethan spoke. "Your work is incredible, Sarah. I'm proud of you." "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with sincerity. "That means a lot. This painting," he gestured toward Full Circle, "it feels familiar, like it tells both our stories." Sarah nodded, her eyes meeting his. "It does." As the evening wore on, they talked briefly, their words filled with kindness and understanding. There was no need for apologies or explanations. Those had long since been given. Instead, their conversation felt like two old friends catching up, the tension of the past replaced by mutual respect. When Ethan left, he turned back to give Sarah a final wave. She returned it with a smile, feeling lighter than she had in years. Their paths had crossed once more, not as a rekindling of what once was, but as a recognition of what had been and what now existed separately. That night, as Sarah stood before Full Circle, she felt a profound sense of closure. Her journey with Ethan, though painful, had shaped her into the person she was today, and for that she was grateful. Miles away, Ethan sat by his window watching the snow fall. He thought of Sarah and the strength she had found, a quiet sense of peace settling over him. They had come full circle, their stories no longer intertwined but forever connected by the lives they had rebuilt. Both were ready for whatever came next. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel.